in Urbana-Champaign, and I did most of that through a distance program, which I found to be one of the better educational experiences of my life. I have an assignment for you. Take out a traditional technology, a pen and a paper. You can do it on your laptop if you want. Take one concept or one thing that you have to teach, preferably something that represents your field, in its whole or part thereof, and see if you can express it in some way other than writing a paragraph with grammatical sentences. Don't use ungrammatical sentences either. Just something that illustrates what it is that is important to you, something that you teach or have a passion for. We'll let you do that for a few minutes. For those who just came in, the URL, if you want to follow along, sometimes that can be distracting, is right here. I apologize it's so long. It will be linked to the conference site. I've emailed it to them, but they haven't gotten it around to linking it yet. So think of one concept, something that you teach that's important. Sketch it out. And just so I have an idea, how many are from libraries that I have here? Most. How many are from faculty, law faculty? We've got a few. Legal research and writing, technology. We've got a few. Okay. Give you one more minute to think. Now, the point of this is to ask yourself the question, how effective are you in making that model that you've drawn explicit when you teach, and particularly with reference if you use PowerPoint or if you create online tutorials or guides, if you use CALI software, how effective are you in making that explicit? A number of years ago, there was an airline that crashed off the West Coast, and I had a friend who is a senior fellow with Raytheon, and he is an aeronautical engineer, and he commented, he said, you know, the pilots did exactly what they were trained to do, but the plane crashed anyway because they failed to think. And I use that as an illustration that there's a difference between training and being trained to do something and thinking. At least I'd like to make a difference, and being educated. And one of the most important things we do is we want to get our students beyond training, beyond tutorials and guides that train, to tutorials and guides that help them think and see the world differently. Trained people are prepared for the problems that are anticipated, that are known. Educated people are prepared for the unknown. Trained people are accustomed to the tools that are available at the moment. Educated people understand that the tools they may need may have yet to be developed and are ready to seize hold of them. So that's the distinction I'd like to make. Since my background is legal research, I will use those examples heavily, but there's no reason that these principles can't be applied widely to a variety of different legal fields and subdisciplines. By the way, here's a model that I would have drawn. More on that later. But this is something I use to map out the terrain of legal research resources that are available. I'll go into that a little more later. Why bother with conceptual frameworks? That's the question. Well, how is that important to this process? Well, here's the problem. Find Ursa Major and Draco. How many of you can find Ursa Major? Don't tell your neighbor what it is. How many think they can find it? 2. Okay. How many, knowing that it's the Big Dipper, can find it? Having the model of a dipper, that concept of a cup, is essential. Draco's the dragon, the thing that kind of looks like a tadpole. Models are essential. Who sees something in this photograph? Anyone see anything? Who sees a cow? Who, now that they've said there's a cow, how many people see a cow? Okay. And that wasn't a cow, by the way. That's a bull if you've been raised on a farm. Now you've got the outline, the aid. Now that you know, how many cannot see the cow? Okay. This is part of the dilemma of being a teacher, is you can no longer not see or not understand your field and your subject. Okay, you're walking around and you can see it and you can't understand. And where this was demonstrated to me effectively was when I took a usability engineering class and learning how to design learning how to design websites. Because you have the engineers and computer scientists, and they can't understand why somebody can't use their site. They're familiar, it makes perfectly sense to them and all their friends. But because they operate with a certain set of models and conceptual frameworks. And so the challenge is to try and step out of that and to make explicit what it is that you're using. Okay. Can you all see something that just came in on the screen here? What do you see? You see a picture? Just to give you, we're talking about frameworks and why you need them and how they're valuable, and that's the key. We do not first see and then define. We define first and then we see. Before you can make sense of something, you essentially need a conceptual framework. I believe that's true regardless of learning style. Some may differ with me. Basically, this comes from semantic network theory. Memory is organized in networks. Learning is the process of building knowledge structures. And research has shown that when ideas are structured, they work better. And the real key, problem solvers have better networks, better frameworks that they utilize. To illustrate, one last example to make the point. Socrates was having a debate on what the nature of knowledge is, and he proves that a slave boy can deduce the Pythagorean theorem. You remember that theorem? It's that the sum of the square, or that the hypotenuse is equal to the square root of the sums of the squares of the two other sides. How does he do it? He draws this figure in the sand, and then he works the boy through the model. He says, if we have a triangle down here in the corner, and we want to figure out the relationship of C to B and A, first we note that, let me go back slide, I jumped ahead. Side A, if you were to square A, you would have two triangles, the area represented by two triangles. And you really are in a law session if you just walked in, even though we're doing some geometry. Side B is also the square, those two triangles. And if we look at C, it happens to be four triangles. This would be the space. And using that, he's able to help the slave boy deduce the Pythagorean theorem. Okay. Why use frameworks with electronic media? I mean, really, we should be using them all over, and I try to. Well, one of the reasons is very quickly you learn that those wonderful, as a librarian, handouts and guides where you have a lot of text, when you put them up on the web, you really don't get the traffic you were expecting. That just taking content and sticking it up on the web doesn't do a whole lot. Just-in-time learning. This is probably more of an argument about why even bother with electronic media in the first place. As a librarian, it's because that student needs to know at 2 in the morning how to find a case by its name when he doesn't have the citation. Or he needs to know something, or she needs to know something about tax research or international law, and there's no one available. It's picking the time when they're motivated, when they're getting ready to go out. And the school may have ended. They're going out to their first clerkship. And so tutorials and guides, frameworks, it's a good time to introduce them. Nonlinear capabilities of multimedia. One of the things that we have inherited as a culture is The book culture was basically, it was an industrial process that you produced these massive printed volumes and you would read them and then you would go discuss them. It was a very linear process. And even what we're doing right now, PowerPoint, is a very linear process. But when you have multimedia, if you're using it effectively, you're changing that to where you have options of a variety of different ways that you can do and students can do. Here's one. Let me open it up on the web. And the thing about this is here we've dropped in to the middle of something, and if it's really linear, there shouldn't be a middle. But the student has many choices. They choose what it is, what chunk of knowledge, chunking is a related concept, that they want to know, where they want to go. They're in charge of the learning experience and directing it. It's really, we're moving away from the notion of an industrial printed book and we're going to have industrial quality education where we're going to do this to you, to more of placing the control in their hands and trying to make them responsible for the learning process. And so that's one reason why. Nesting of layers of information. I think I just already illustrated that within a given site, when you're building just a web page, it doesn't have to be a tutorial, that one of the problems is too much information on the surface. And so nesting the layers of information can be critical, just enough information at the time so that you don't overwhelm. And here's an example, not a tutorial, but a website. I don't know if it's the greatest site. I developed this. But one of the things we wanted to do is nest the amount of information that was available so that the user wouldn't be overwhelmed. And electronic media is great for doing that within the context of frameworks. Learning at the user's pace. We all have different times. Schemata and schema in interface design. What are schema? What are schemata? Schema is really something is meant to convey the essence of something. And one understands to the extent that incoming information, you understand to the extent that it conforms to your schema. It's really a conceptual framework. It's just another term of art. It's a predefined pattern. Perhaps I can show you an example. When Steve Jobs, founder of Apple, went to Park, and he was in this film, The Revenge of the Nerds, I think it was called, or something like that. And they showed him what they were working on. And they had a couple of really amazing innovations. I can't remember, one was networking, mouse. But they said the thing, he said, I didn't even see those. The thing was the icon. And schema are about more than about icon. What's happening here? If you look at this pattern of icons that I've taken from a Windows XP system, what is it that they convey to you? You don't even think about it anymore. It's so natural. I mean, here we are. We've got to teach people to use this new equipment to do routines in their daily lives that they haven't been doing before. What do these icons do? What is the framework we're walking within? It's their office. It's their desktop. Okay? Everything. I mean, you got fax machines and recycling bins. And we don't even think about it. We take it for granted. It's become invisible to us. And part of that's the problem as a teacher is you may be teaching some software or some concept, and the schema is perfectly, it's there for you, but it's now hidden. You don't even think about it. And for the students, it's entirely new. This, again, is something that relates to creation of web tutorials and guides. Learning styles. In vogue, that's the trend. Talk about it. You'll see all over charts as to different kinds of learners. I guess I pay attention to this because I have a son who's autistic, and I'm always meeting with counselors talking about tactile learning versus auditory, different ways. And some of these models, this media can be used. You can manipulate. You can have an auditory component. You can do different kinds of things. And we used to assume that law students were a fairly self-selecting group, and to the extent they are, they're the people that are good at reading things and analyzing. But I think that's changing, particularly as we promote diversity in the admissions process. I don't think we can continue to assume that the law students are going to be the same kinds as admitted 50 years ago. There's going to be a broader range of learning types. And, oh, sorry. Somebody didn't like my presentation. It's ironic that I would announce the death to bullet points with bullet points, but I've been through presentations that have been killed by the overuse of presentation. I've given many presentations that have been killed by the overuse of bullet points. And we got to find something beyond the linear PowerPoint death by bullet point. And so that's the reason why the extra effort, and it is extra effort, to try and take the learning experience to the next level. Some of the tools that you might need to do this. Well, I think one of the first things to do is develop a terminology and develop the artist's eye in the sense of detecting what are frameworks, when do they use, how do they work. You use them every day. They're all around us. What are some of the different kinds of functions? There's a series of different kinds, and we'll go through those. And you may think of this list as one I created. It's not meant to be exhaustive, but and you may have some of your own. Structural frameworks, how it works. It's really from the designer's perspective, and it doesn't reveal how it functions. Really, if you needed to take the train from Boston to New York, this schema is not going to be helpful. And sometimes the problem we do that with software is that's the instructions we hand out to using something. It's from the designer's perspective. And what's really needed is something more like this, how to use it. This is from London's rail system. And it's the user's perspective, and it minimizes the amount of necessary information. And that's often the key to a good model, is trying to minimize. Yes, there's the danger of oversimplification. Yes, you could become trapped by your model and not be able to see other things. But the idea is to make it explicit, and then to encourage the student to develop their own models and their own way of thinking about the problems. Functional. In a legal context. So here's one that I work with. I like to think of the research cycle, and maybe let me link into that here. If my image is outlined with a small blue line, it usually means there's a link underlying it. So, the research cycle, I like to start with, Bob Baring calls this finding your best hit, your best document. Find one good document on point. And I might use a variety of techniques to do that. Terms and connectors, natural language, different tools. And then after I found that, to use that as my template to find everything else that's similar. And it could be a case, it could be a treatise. I find one great book from Oxford Press on Icelandic law or something. And then I use that to find everything else that's similar through a variety of techniques. It could be your Library of Congress subject headings. It could be more like this, searching in Lexis. It could be West topic and key numbers. Then I want to make sure that it's still good law, if it's a legal source. And they've got to do a complete analysis. And then understanding. As a tax attorney, the thing I learned that just finding the law was only the first step, because chances were you found your statute, you wouldn't understand it. And not only that you wouldn't understand the context, how it related to 50 other provisions in the Internal Revenue Code and sections and regulations, etc., case law. And so that process. Now here is the cycle. Underneath, if you click on them, you can go to different parts, more information, tutorials. It's an experiment for me. I consider myself not an expert, by the way, but a student in learning how to do these kinds of things. So let me find back where I was here. So functional frameworks. And here's another one. This was developed by a former colleague of mine, Peter Hook, on legislative history. And if we take a look at this, he's got this nice little process-oriented, this bill starts with a, I was thinking of Schoolhouse Rock, committee prints, committee hearings, congressional debates, and you can click into different levels of information. Again, an example of nesting the amount of information that's available. So functional frameworks. Metaphorical. What's the connection here? I have this contest with my students. If ALR were an animal, what would it be? What's the rationale? Yeah, it doesn't fit like the others. Here you have something that's really a secondary resource. It's both a secondary and a primary resource. You got an article with the case. Then the way it comes out, it's not like an encyclopedia being issued all at once. It's issued over time in segments. It's not like an encyclopedia in that it is an exhaustive treatment of everything. What it is slices. It's the best case on a particular issue. And so it's these slices, and the whole of them do make up pretty comprehensive coverage, but it's not the same approach as say, corpus juris secundum. It's a lot of snapshots of the law in moments of time. So it doesn't fit like anything else. So you need, and teaching the students to understand it is one of the harder jobs. And to remember it. They can learn it for the period you need for the exam, but to get them to use it in practice and understand why, which is unfortunate. So I use the platypus. Narrative. I was trying to illustrate that there are different kinds of problems, and one kind that you will encounter as an attorney. One is statistical. My very first assignment was as a research clerk at a firm in L.A. I was working actually for my father and uncle. We had a small tax firm together. And that's where I spent the 9 years after law school. But the very first assignment was to determine the average age of retirement for female OBGYN physicians. Actually, it was in Orange County. I hadn't a clue how to go about that. The purpose of that, a narrative is just a story. It's supposed to be memorable, and it has some sort of meaning that can be extracted from it. And we use narrative all the time. Relational frameworks. Actually, all conceptual frameworks are relational of some kind. This I stole from the Wrens, like most of my ideas. I steal from other people. And I've used this. I'm optimistic that our law students understand by the time they graduate that there are 3 branches of government. And what the Wrens pointed out is usually they don't understand. I found this to be true, that the law coming out of those 3 branches of government is usually organized at least 2 ways, chronologically and topically. And I've added a third column to say we really organize law a third way, which is by citation. And I've sat down with, I work with Asian law students, foreign LLMs. A lot of ours come from Asia. And you ask them, how many books do you need to be a practicing attorney? Show me with your hands, and it's like this much. And then we show them our library. And they just have no way to figure out why you need all this stuff. And so frameworks are very... So one of the things I do is I put out a table, and I put tape down, and I bring out all the books. And I actually use books, even though I belong to a book club even. I'm a bibliophile. And we sit there and we figure out where do statute books go, and where do session laws go, and where do they fit into this grid. And that seems to be helpful, for at least for the tactile learners. Here's another relational framework. One of the difficulties is trying to, when teaching students about shepherdizing and site checking, to get them beyond looking at just the stop sign that appears on the case when they pull it up on Lexis, that you really have it's similar to they have to think of precedent as in a stream of time. And when they're checking that citation, they need to check the stream. We need to check the primary case. We need to see what happens with subsequent cases. Have they been overturned? And we need to see what our case was built upon. And there have been instances, I think Davis v. Beeson, it's an old Supreme Court case on polygamy from the 1890s. And when you go through sometimes it gets, it's Romer, the Colorado case on the special amendment dealing with special rights and dealing with gays and homosexuals. And that case, if you look on one system it's a red flag, on the other it's a cautionary flag. And then you look at the different parts of it and you'll see that what it's built on is treated very differently. So having them understand this type of framework is very important over time. Formulaic. What is sometimes economy of expression is important. One of my favorite rules is when teaching searching on Lexis and Westlaw is anytime you have more than one connector, you have to use parentheses. you have to control the search. And there's an order that Lexis and Westlaw have. The computer goes through to figure out what operators are done well, when. But you need to understand, to make sure that you're in control, you've got to use the parentheses. Another is precision and recall. I think it's important to teach law students those concepts. Why? Because in one instance you may have the question, the partner comes to you and he says he wants law on a given topic. And really you need to find out, does he want everything there is on a subject, or does he want just the best document, article, case, etc. on point? Precision has to do with those of you without a library and information science background, is of the documents you retrieve, whether in a search, whether catalog or Lexis or Westlaw or within your library, the documents you get in hand, how many are relevant? And recall has to do with a different measure, and that is of the documents retrieved that were relevant, what percentage do they represent of what was available to you? They're two very different measures, and they conflict, and they're at odds, and it's impossible to satisfy both. We'll talk about that later in a minute. So formulate. Contrastive. Here's an example. The Gila monster doesn't make a good pet, and it's not used generally that I know of as a corporate logo, whereas the cuddly iguana seems to be in vogue for a lot of Mexican food chains and beers and things, and is a pet. And the idea is to develop the sensitive eye, the contrast, what's different, cultivating discernment, what's different. And you often need a technical nomenclature to do that. So here's one that I use. I call this problem typing. And again, I stole it from somebody else and adapted it for law. I stole it from a government documents library. But problems are different than we have. When the senior partner comes in and says, I want the California case in which the court ruled that a fetus cannot be a human being. It's a murder case, the defendant beat up his girlfriend, I need it in 5 minutes. That's a very different kind of problem than I need to understand Wisconsin water law with respect to pollution. Just fundamentally, the tools that you would differ and how you approach the problem are fundamentally different. And so you need to cultivate with the students a discernment. And again, this applies outside of to any discipline. Institutional, if you know that you need some Justice Department guidelines on merging medical practices and when it's an antitrust issue, the key to solving that problem is probably the Justice Department going to its website. It's a different kind of problem. Understanding how to use those government resources. Statistical, what percentage of the children in Los Angeles are below the poverty line. Special techniques, tax forms, census material, patents, and news. So often for international research, I was doing something where I needed information on internet regulation in China. Well, in the news resources, I found the regs translated into English that I needed for the information I needed for my article. So cultivating and using that framework to help students discern different types of problem, where to even begin, I think is essential. Complemental. Again, here's that trade-off between precision and recall. West showed up at one of the TREC conferences, or one that was similar to it. That's where they have people who are specialists in information retrieval systems. And they have these conferences, and they go and they present papers on their information retrieval design and how it worked and the testing they did. They raced their little search engines to see who had the best one. Well, West showed up at one of these, and they published the paper. I found it buried on the internet at one of the conference sites. And I extrapolated the data and put it in a graph. But what's really important is that it illustrates the relationship of precision to recall. That when you're at a point where your data, you have over 90% of the items that show up in your search set are on point, that means your recall is below 10%. Okay, that you only got 10% of the stuff in the database that's relevant. It's just one of those laws in information science. And if you want to, if you want to push that recall out, you want to find everything, you're going to have a lot of junk. I mean, we can do things to try and ferret it out and do the best we can. But generally, there's a relationship there. What's interesting is these searches were all done by attorney researchers at West when they did the study. And there's a comparison here between Boolean and natural language. One of the more interesting figures is for students to realize that in a typical search, when you that produces 20 search results on a screen, that's often the default. That a typical search, it's only about 17 or 18%. Here, it's 25% of the relevant resources in the database were actually found. And so, trying to teach those concepts to students so they become more informed users and searchers, I think, is important. And you need some frameworks to do that. Oppositional, this is taken from library science, one of the two founding fundamental frameworks for our philosophy, dealing with really an oppositional framework. You know, the idea of librarianship is to eliminate the noise, improve the communication. We're communications theorists at heart, but we're really concerned with describing opposing forces. Okay, analytic. I call this working the problem. And what we really want to do is we're taking something apart and we're looking at the prerequisites, the constituent elements, the criteria. Again, nomenclature becomes very important here. Here is one as part of the tutorial I use for our research boot camp that we have after finals. If you saw the movie Apollo 13, Ed Harris is in the control room and he's reacting to all sorts of negative information about the spacecraft. People are panicking. And he says, hold on, people, let's work the problem. Let's not make things worse by guessing. And that's something I try to stress with my students is before you even get into the library, you need to stop and figure out what you know. And to use that, I use the framework we all learned in 8th grade English, which is the who, what, where, when, why. And I have a set of criteria. Talk about parties. I remember one of the first contracts I drafted to sell a corporation, and the partner said to me, you know, this is wonderful. It's beautifully written, but we represent the buyer, not the seller. And you do that in research too. We need to be cognizant. Is the entity we're representing a trust? Is a corporation? The what? Descriptive words and facts. You know, what is it that we're trying? What are the terms of art? And if you don't know, ask. I tell my students, when you're talking to the senior partner, he may or she may already have in mind some of the terminology that you will need to use. I use an example from O.J. Simpson. This is a fairly, I think, difficult problem in extracting. And I don't know that he did this. I know that he was able to preserve some of his assets with a retirement plan. But since I used to practice in that area, it's really hypothetical. But I use this as kind of an example of how you go about extracting terms and to formulate your search. So that's part of my framework. Specific sources, a lot of times people will have in mind something you should use. Where, applicable jurisdictions, when, time periods, you know, how soon do you want this back? Is it more important than this? What are we trying to accomplish here? Precision and recall, again, that goes to that concept. Do you want all the relevant resources on subject? Do you just want, and what format? Do you want back a stack of papers with highlights? Do you want sticky notes? Do you want a memo? What are you expecting? You know, what will cost? So that's my framework for working the problem. And that's an analytical framework. Now, the opposite of, or here's another example. This is something I'm experimenting with in advanced legal research, but I've actually, this last year, did more as an independent study with some of my LLM students, is having them go through and take different types of resources apart and look at how they work. And so there's a framework there. You can click on it and open it up. Systemic is the opposite. We're looking at the big picture. Depicts one or more subjects in relationship to the whole. And the genus, the family is important. Here I have, this is kind of my map, I showed it to you earlier, of legal research instruction, legal research resources and where they fit into the universe. And maybe let's open this up a little bit here. And basically, if you were to map the terrain of materials and to primary and secondary resources in one axis, and things that were organized chronologically in another axis versus subject, and then print versus electronic, you could start putting things in the different octants. And I find, for instance, if I have a case reporter database, well, cases generally come out chronologically, and they're generally entered into the database chronologically. It's a primary resource, and it's electronic. And that area I've shaded in blue. It's because if I have a certain type of problem, a known item problem, in which I need to know the California case in which the court ruled that a fetus cannot be a human being, it was a murder case in which the defendant beat up his girlfriend. If I know all those facts, I'm going to turn most of the time, as a general rule of thumb, to that octant, the chronological primary electronic resources. On the other hand, if I need to understand Wisconsin water law, it's more of a general subject search. I'm going to look, at this point in time, more at print materials and a secondary resource. Now, the question here is why, where do things like case digests that we work so hard to teach, where do they fit? And they're not in these two quadrants because it's really, if you think about it, it's a subject arrangement of primary law. True, it's just summaries of the cases. It's in yet this, the next quadrant here. And that's not to say it's not important. What I'm saying is that's not where you start. Why wouldn't you start if you have a topical thing? I need to understand Wisconsin water law. Well, the reason you start with an encyclopedia because the issue may be largely dictated by statute. And even if I go to a case law digest, I can find all the cases on Wisconsin water law. But the problem is do I know which ones are the most important, which ones are used in practice? So to us, that seems fairly intuitive. But to somebody from China who's trying to understand our legal system, giving them a general rule of thumb is helpful. And so I use, this is kind of, anyway, this is a systemic model. There are things that occupy each of those octants, and I'm trying to relate individual sources or techniques or databases to the whole. Where do they fit in the whole scheme of things? And as part of the experiment I'm doing, I have a worksheet where they go through and they take this resource and try to figure out where does it fit in relationship to other resources, and where does it fit in the research process? Where should it be used? Computational, same thing. It's just the ability to manipulate, the ability to calculate, kind of like the example of Socrates and the slave boy. Something that you can put your hands around, good for those tactile learners. And here I have some questions. And where would you start? And I start asking these questions, and it's just a rollover. And they can go through and see the answers. So this is more of an interactive type of tutorial that they can use and work through. In the interest of time, I think we'll move along. You can play with that on your own. If you're interested in rollovers, I get questions, and it seems some of these techniques may seem like more work than you want to get into. Rollovers are a great thing because you can make your presentations interactive, and they're not that hard. Here's the code. Essentially, there's always two components. It's a JavaScript, which means there'll be a component that's in the heading tag, which is at the top, and there'll be a component down in the body. And essentially, you're defining some variables with different images, and as you roll over certain areas and you define them with coordinates, if you use PaintShop Pro or a graphical program, you can see the coordinates of your image and use coordinates to dictate when you're within a certain area that they'll change. So that's a tool I use. Environmental. We want to show the environment or ecosystem. Here's the other great model that's used in library and information science from Werman. And he places the individual at the center. And how do they go about gathering information? It's conversation, and then they might go to some reference type sources, and then news. And that's kind of his model. I've actually adapted this and seen it used. I've been studying how law changes in relationship to changes in the information environment. This kind of model is very useful for that, more of a holistic approach. And here's a summary. Now it's your turn. I'm done, and we have 20 minutes. it's now time to work in groups. And one of the things we have to be careful with our tutorials and guides is that we don't ignore some of the other trends and theory that's out there that talks about group work. But I'd like you to, in small groups, 2s or 3s, think about how would you teach the use of legal track to some first-year students. It may seem obvious to you how you would use it. And there's some concerns you need to think about when using it. These are the problems, at least I've found, and you may see others. Students don't understand what's being searched. Is it the full text or is it an abstract? What's the difference between searching by subject or keyword? Subject is control vocabulary. Human beings are there. In fact, I find the same problem in teaching West topic and key numbers. That they're human beings, an army of gnomes up in Minneapolis that sit there and overnight digest these cases for us. Understanding how results are presented. What's the relevancy search? That the best result may be on top. Understanding the nature of subject fields and the relationship to human indexers. I've mentioned that. And knowing when to use the resource. That's probably the biggest. When do you use this? Where does it fit in the research cycle? Go. And then let's work for 10 minutes and then we'll talk. So if you can work with somebody, turn around. I've talked enough. Turn around, find somebody. It's time to work. Get out your pen and paper. How would you teach this? And put up. And if this doesn't work for you, you can use your own problem. But to save time, I've got one for you here.
No, actually,
You're right. There's some application right away that
It's also true that take care.
I'm no lawyer by any stretch of the means, but as far as the concept of it's very applicable.
All right, why don't we turn around and let's start. And I'm going to ask for your help now. This group over here, what did you work on? What did you find? What problems were you concerned with?
Well, I guess we really kind of split up the discussion into kind of like, well, why we could search and we could track as opposed to something else, and then and then like how we do it, and I ran out of time before we actually got to the how you do it part. But I guess basically what we were trying to come up with was like a framework of
Go ahead, draw. Great.
say how we could actually do this.
Make it happen. Get your students up to the blackboard.
All right. In general, I guess that what we were really thinking about was like when the attorneys, when the students are actually kind of thinking about trying to solve legal problems, usually when an attorney is making a decision about like how to whether to choose a certain source or case, they're really thinking about in two different dimensions. There's several different, but one might be like authority, which kind of covers the whole primary or secondary authority, and you kind of want, usually when you're citing, you want the authorities to be, as high value as possible. And then the other one is relevance, I guess, like kind of like factual, similarity, to the cases. And where we got hung up on was that, you know, it was really, you know, well, if you talk about in theory, you might say, oh, well, if I wanted to find out, you know, whether or not there were any, you know, cases on this issue, well, maybe I should go straight to like, you know, like the statutes of the digest or something like that. So the question is, well, how do you convince people that that legal track is a good thing to go to, even though there are these like full text, you know, databases on Lexis and Westlaw with the full text of the articles in them, and then also, you know, or as opposed to going to like the state statute databases or the case law databases or what have you. And so basically, you know, the thing that we really focused on was the concept of relevance, and that legal track, even though it's not oftentimes the full text of the actual articles, what you tend to get are those abstracts, you know, of what the articles are about. And a lot of times I think the students kind of get sucked into, oh, I'll just dive into the full text journal article databases on, like, you know, Lexis and Westlaw, and they start reading through. And as somebody in the group pointed out, well, what that does is that starts to suck up time. And a lot of times, you know, but if you really focus on time, well, to students, time means good marks. So you could say, well, even though it's not as high an authority, it's really useful to know, you know, that it's available because it can really help you focus quickly on, you know, some of the relevant you know, cases and statutes. So that's where, you know, we only got that far. I mean, there's other parts to this process.
I think that's helpful. The authority versus the relevance, I see a lot. I mean, the problem with searching full text databases, primary source, is you'll often get too much information, or paradoxically not enough. And having a human being, and a lot of this comes down to what's the value of intermediated information in the process, and how you illustrate that. I like that. Telling that beyond authority, we also need to focus on relevance and what's right on point that can help us. Good. Next group. Yes.
We kind of hanging on to this, another wide argument we found that, and we drew little bubbles with lines next to them, a little tiny bubble that shows the scope and the...
You can draw it if you'd rather, but...
Little bubble that shows the scope and the depth of the Lexis full text coverage. You know, so it's, you know, call it probably 200 titles. And, you know, basically 1994. And then you have
oh, yeah.
ILP, or legal track, is 850 titles and 1980.
Yeah.
This part is still frustrating, but
Good. Good.
there's stuff.
Yeah, I think High Online, you come up with that too. Trying to explain to my faculty that not only were we one of the last schools to acquire it, and that was the reason to acquire it, but that the coverage is very different, making those arguments. In the back, there are two groups or one group in the back there?
We spent more time talking about
Okay.
because we all have three different sets of limitations. That's a very interactive way of teaching.
I like the hands-on, at least with electronics. So what I've done in teaching is I have 5 or 6 questions and regular capacity groups, and then each group goes out, tries to find the answer. The one that thinks they find the answer first raises their hand, and then they get to pick another group to come up to the board and guide them through the answer. And if they guide them through correctly, that group gets a point. If they don't, if they stumble somehow or don't get the right answer, the other group gets a point.
So they not only have to find it, they have to teach others to use it. With the idea being that by being a teacher, they'll learn more.
Yeah, well, no, it's more that they're discovering. For me, I like to discover things on my own. So they're discovering, trying to discover it, and in the process of discovering it, the others are coming along.
Okay. You know, and I think the use of group work is so critical. And that's, I think, one of the biggest challenges with electronic medium is seeing that you utilize group work. I learned that in library school. It was so different experience than law school at Cornell, which I love, but just the interaction was so different and contributed to the learning process. That constant working with people all over the United States and some outside the country. Other questions? Did you have something you wanted to contribute?
You were our under, and we have a publisher who is not familiar with
I need more time to gel, okay? I understand. Over on this side.
Well, one of the biggest problems teaching legal track is that it's outside of our students' culture. On reading full text in front of them right away. So, to me, and this is very true when teaching people past a certain age, you have to motivate them to want to learn the tool. And when we teach legal track, we spend a lot of time motivating them about the tool, just educating them about the tool. That it's a big thing 24 hours. It's very different than it covers twice the amount of stuff as well. And we make it relevant to them.
Can you think of a framework that you would do that in for motivation?
That's the framework.
What is, what could you do to help them understand? Yes, over here.
One of the things that I use is giving them an example, because all of our students are on a journal of some sort. So they have a familiarity with this literature. And I say, think about the last journal article you read or looked at or edited, and think about what the title was, and explain to me how the title had anything to do with what that journal is actually about, what that article is actually about. And wouldn't it be nice if you had somebody read every journal article for you and pick from a list of, say, 450 subject headings exactly what it was that the journal was about?
I'm a big believer in exercises in frustration as motivating students to learn. So if you set them up with the impossible search, okay, I want you to find everything by Ronald Rotunda on the nomination process. And Ronald Rotunda is at Illinois. Was one of the most widely cited. And if they just ran a simple search through the database for his name, they had, like 3,000 hits, 4,000 hits. So in that context, I could then go back and start talking about techniques to narrow down what he'd written, and not just things that had cited to him. And one example is by using segments or fields, and the other is you could flip over into legal track and do a search that way. But a framework, getting that picture in their minds of what the differences are. Yes?
We thought very much along the same line as Scott, and so our illustration was two overlapping circles, and they didn't, the Lexis Westlaw full text circle didn't fit neatly inside. There was a little piece that stuck out.
Could you draw that? I'd like to see that. I need to see it. If you can draw on this side, we can. That should be in the job interview. How can an artist?
So this is the world of legal periodical articles indexed by Legal Track, and here's in the full text ones that appear in Lexis and Westlaw or something like that. So there's a little piece that's not covered by Legal Track that you might miss, and we didn't know how to. It's the trashier stuff too that's out there.
Yeah.
The legal newspapers. They get indexed in Legal Track.
Yeah, that's part of the downside sometimes. But sometimes you want those. So good. No, circles is good. I think we were trying to figure out how to teach law review and some others at Illinois how to do their interlibrary loan, and we had a series of different consortium that we were a part of, and we wanted to be cost effective, so we came up with concentric rings. Starting with our own library and then going to on campus and then going to the wider Illinois network. I've forgotten the name now. And then the Pac-10 schools, and then we had, or it was the Big 10 schools. We had a consortium, and then finally WorldCat. Good. Others? Same group? over here, or up front here.
I think we should have relied on more of a narrative framework
Mm-hmm.
in that we're just telling each other how it is that we teach.
You have a story,
And
a memorable story.
well, an example perhaps of a memorable story would be, I don't know if it's a comparative framework, where we ask a student to search a professor on TV.
Mm-hmm.
They retrieve their 3 or 4 things. Single track also 40 this person.
Mm-hmm.
And those aren't available full text on those databases. So they've all had this professor who's very popular in the first year of curriculum. And when they realize, oh, I can see these articles, I wouldn't have had access to had I just relied on full text. But I think that final output, it just doesn't matter. They really don't care. It's interesting.
A pessimist. The glass is half empty.
And part of the frustration is, to pick on legal track as a particular tool, is that you can no longer limit it to your own holdings.
Mm-hmm.
And so, who's buying whatever it is, Los Angeles Daily Journal, because everybody comes to the desk with your 4 citations of legal track.
So the problem is the tool. Yeah, I better change my example. I'm discouraged now. I'm totally depressed after hearing your. No.
I relied on a more narrative approach.
Yeah, but a more narrative. I think so. I think so much of what we do, motivation is so key to learning, and they're so enamored with this full text power that they have. Not that full text doesn't have its place. Others, comments up front? Yes.
You took the circles and thought more about Venn diagrams.
Mm-hmm.
And I've expanded it, so okay, here's what you get in Westlaw, here's what you get in Lexis, here's what you get in Hine, and how they all overlap, but there's still a large
Sure.
number of journals that aren't included.
Sure. Okay, good. I had 2 things that I kind of do. It's and I use this. It used to be that we teach Yahoo as being similar to a catalog. Now we teach the catalog as being similar to Yahoo. Anyone know what Yahoo stands for? Hierarchical Officious Oracle. Yes, hierarchical. The key is they're human beings. And human beings go through and decide where things fit. There is a search engine component to it, but the categories and human beings kind of certify if something should fit within that part. And you submit your website, you tell them where you think it fits and alternates, and they go through it. Whereas the Google, we have an algorithmic search based on different criteria. So the contrast of the two. And explaining that contrast is one way of dealing with, because they know Yahoo and they know Google, is explaining the value of something like Legal Track, where you have human beings who go through and assign categories, and Google being contrasted to that free text database. Another might be a functional, that you find the one great book in your library on point, or one great article, and then you look it up in Legal Track. I have here with a book, but you take the article, look up in Legal Track, and see what are the subject headings it falls under, and and then find what everything else is under the same subject heading. I mean, for librarians, that's pretty intuitive. We don't think about it, but the key is a lot of this, you already know it. It's making it explicit, making that process explicit, bringing it to the front. And I think we are, I'm sorry, I kept you over, but I just would like to end by saying, encouraging you to keep up the good fight, and hopefully you've got something out of this that will be useful, and I hope you have a great conference. Thanks.